Welcome, everybody. I'm very glad you could make it to this evening's webinar, which is Creating Certainty for Your Future. And we're going to be exploring the importance of a well-structured estate plan. An estate plan is an absolutely critical part of the overall financial planning process. And it can be very complex because every situation is different, no family is alike, and the wishes of people are going to be quite different as well. So what I'd like to do is start by introducing myself for those on the line that don't know me. My name is Brett Millard. I'm the Regional Director for IG Wealth here in the Okanagan. I'm a certified financial planner, as well as a chartered investment manager. And in addition to my day job, I'm also the chairman of the board of FP Canada, which is our national professional body and certification body for the financial planning industry. I've been on the board for about 6.5 years now. I spent 2 years in the vice chair role, and last summer, just about a year ago, I took over as chair of the board. And I think it gives me a unique perspective on what's happening in our industry as a whole, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about that at the end of the presentation if you'd like. Joining me here in the Okanagan, there's a team of 38 financial planning professionals, and the majority of those all have their CFP designation as well. And backing up those financial planners is an additional 32 support staff between our Kelowna and Penticton offices. Now, the slide on your screen also shows the in-house specialist team that we have here in the Okanagan. Olga is our insurance and estate specialist. Kevin is our securities and wealth planning specialist. And Mark is the mortgage planning specialist. And the reason I highlight that is we have a very large team behind us and specialists in all sorts of different areas. And that's a combination of these in-house, in-region specialists like Olga, Kevin, and Mark, as well as nationally, we have our advanced financial planning team, which is a team filled with trust and estate lawyers, tax lawyers, accountants, and advanced financial planning specialists as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. Now, before we get started today, I want to talk really quickly about the format that we're using to host the webinar this afternoon. We're using Zoom, and I know that Zoom has been in the media recently, and there's been some issues with it being hacked. So people get onto a Zoom meeting and they share their screen with inappropriate images, etc. We're using a professional paid version of Zoom, so the screen and the microphone should all be locked down, meaning nobody can share anything on the screen or speak unless I, as the host, unlock their screen or microphone. So that should alleviate any issues there. But of course, we'll keep a close eye in case anything does happen. Now, on that note, as far as speaking or questions, if you move your mouse across the screen, or from the top, if you move your mouse up towards the top, the Zoom toolbar comes down. And if you look there, there's a Q&A, there's two little chat windows, and it says Q&A for question and answer on it. If you'd like to submit a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A at any time. There is also a chat function, but I'm going to ask everybody to use the Q&A and not the chat because it's hard for me to watch two different windows at the same time. Now, to respect everybody's time, I'm going to keep most of the questions till the end of the presentation. That way I can get up through all the material in the allotted time, and those that want to stick around for questions after can, and those that would like to log off the call at that time can do so as well. But having said that, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A window as we're going through, and if I see any questions that are directly pertaining to the part of the presentation I'm talking about, and if it's appropriate, I may answer some as we go along as well. And of course, we don't have the answer to every possible question, but we do have that large team of professional specialists in the background. So I can always reach out to one of them and get back to you if we're not sure what the answer is to your question today. So I'd like to start just going over the agenda really quickly. And why I say really quickly is I do have a lot of material here, and I, again, want to be aware of everybody's time and not go over. So I am going to go through it fairly quickly. And of course, there's time for questions at the end as well, or you can always follow up with us later. So I'm going to start with the current market conditions. Normally in an estate planning presentation, I wouldn't really go into the market quite as much, but with everything we're going through right now, the economic downturn and the global pandemic, I think it's important to talk about that a little bit and put that into perspective with the estate planning process. Next, we'll go into Estate Planning 101, and that'll be the overview of the basics of what kind of forms an estate plan, what things to think about, etc. And then I'll move on to the second part, in Estate Planning 201, and we'll talk about minimizing the impact of taxes on the estate and making your estate plan as tax efficient as possible. We'll talk a little bit about how insurance comes into play in estate planning. And finally, I'll wrap it up with the estate planning roadmap and and how the IG's financial planning approach ties in with that as well. Now, as I mentioned, I'd like to start talking about the market volatility piece a little bit. And the reason I want to do that first is this is not new, but it has certainly happened before, but it's happening again right now as we're going through a major market and economic downturn. For the last 11 years, we've been enjoying one of the longest economic expansions in history. And it's been a wonderful growth period for the markets. But when you think back to March 9th, 2009, which is when the cover of this magazine came out, people certainly didn't feel that way, and there was not a lot of optimism. The S&P 500, so the US stock market, was down 50% of the time. The Canadian stock market was down, I think, around 43% at the same time. And the general feeling was capitalism had failed. They're using taxpayer money to bail out corporations, and people thought there was no way that we would ever come out of this. And as you can see from the chart on the right, since 2008 and 2009, the forecast was completely wrong, and the pessimism didn't really make a lot of sense. The S&P 500 from that date is up over 350%, and the Canadian market, the TSX index, is up a little under 200% during the same period. So why is that important? I bring up the 2008 market downturn because it's the most recent, but we've had all sorts of major economic issues before and after that during the last little over a decade as well. And you can see that by some of the other magazine covers that we've got here. There was the Greece economic collapse, the fiscal cliffs in the United States. We had certainly Brexit, which is still an ongoing saga, and many other events that each one seemed like permanent barriers to future financial growth. And each time we heard the same commentary that the markets would never recover this time and the economy worldwide was going to completely collapse. But in each of these instances, the stock market has reacted more or less the same. It started by going down, and then usually fairly quickly, it rebounded and continued on its pattern of growth. And that is certainly what we're expecting today. So I don't want to go through this too much more looking back at 08, but I did want to take a look at the compounded annual returns from December 31st, 2008 to December 31st of 2019. And you can see the US market, the world index, the European index, and the Canadian index have all performed extremely well. But the problem is very few investors actually earn these kind of returns. If your portfolio over that period held simply 25% in each of these four indexes, your compound annual rate of return would have been 11.3% per year. So why aren't people earning those kind of returns? There's two reasons. One is that emotions took control of their investment decisions. And two is that they were not invested in global markets, only in Canada. And most people aren't investing directly in the index, so I can kind of talk about that a little bit more as well and why diversification is so important. So let's talk about the emotional side first. Every time the economy goes through a downturn or the stock market goes through a downturn, this is the roller coaster ride of emotions that many people feel. As the market is going up, people are encouraged, they're confident, they get excited, and optimism reaches an all-time high. And that to me is usually a sign of concern. When you start getting stock tips from your barber, your taxi driver, etc., that's usually a pretty good warning sign that we're going to have a downturn in the near future. On the flip side, as the market goes into a downturn and people get agitated into disparity, nauseous, and eventually that dejection and feeling of hopelessness, that's usually a good sign that things are about to turn around. Now, this cycle has played out over and over for a very long time, and it'll continue to do so again. I'm not trying to tell you that I know exactly where we are in the cycle. I don't know if the end of March was necessarily the bottom and the growth we've had into the first couple of weeks of April is already the start of the recovery. I would be a little bit surprised if it recovers that quickly, but I do know that it will go through these cycles over time again. So making sure that your financial plan and your estate plan are suited for your risk tolerance and your comfort level so that you can ride through these without having that emotional roller coaster and stick to that plan and not make changes based on emotion is very important. The second piece is the diversification. So I'm probably going to have to explain this slide a little bit to some people, but what we're looking at is a number of different investment asset classes. And you'll see a number of them say small cap or large cap. What that means, capitalization of a stock or a company is the size or overall net worth. So if you have a company and it's $10 per share as the current share price, and there's 1 million outstanding shares, that means the company would have a market cap or value of $10 million, with the $10 by the 1 million shares. So when we look at a Canadian small cap or US small cap company, those are typically going to be junior startup, could be a resource company, a technology company, et cetera. In the case of Canadian large cap, that's typically Canadian banks. And most recently, just this week, Shopify took over from TD Bank as the #2 market cap, or the second largest company in Canada. So we can certainly see a bit of a shift when the large market cap in Canada used to be entirely the big banks and the oil companies. Now, of course, a Canadian large cap company is not the same as a US large cap. US large cap is much bigger typically when we have things like Amazon, Facebook, Google. But I wanted to explain that first and then explain about the diversification. You can see in 2010 that Canadian and US small caps are at the very top of the game. And if we look the next 2 years, that Canadian small cap is right near the bottom of the return. It picks up a bit in 13 and then it scrapes along the bottom for most of the rest of the decade, with, of course, the noticeable exception of 2016. Same thing, if you look at 2011, the top performer was Canadian bonds. And the following year and the year after, Canadian bonds were quite low. So if you invest in any one area on its own, your investment experience is going to be a roller coaster. You're going to be going like this, up and down over time. And that's not what most clients would like. They want a much more smooth ride. So if you look in the middle of this chart, all the way along from left to right, you'll see moderate portfolio in pink there. So that's showing a more diversified portfolio and how that's smoothing it out. And the reason I bring this up and why it's so important is that 93% of all Canadians' invested assets are inside of Canada, even though the Canadian investment landscape represents 3% of the global equity space. And that's a real problem. So when we kind of get into the depths of the estate planning and financial planning process, and certainly on the investment management side, we need to make sure we have the proper diversification there so that you can experience that growth that does happen after one of these downturns. So the big question right now, how bad will it get? This was the Economist cover from February, and obviously there's a lot more that's happened since then, but the final answer of that is not necessarily known. We've had a big shock to the global economy and obviously a major health pandemic, and it will take some time to sort out. But governments around the world have been much more aggressive and much quicker to act on their stimulus. And depending on how much we can actually flatten the curve, and depending on whether or not we have what they call the second wave, it may recover a lot quicker than we're expecting right now. With one big caveat, and I think it's important to also talk again about Canada, because Canada will likely have a much slower recovery to the economy for a number of reasons. When we look at the government response plan, the stimulus that's being put out, it's roughly a third of what the US is doing when it's compared against the GDP. So that's not saying it's 1/3 of the US, but the US is a larger country. It's looking directly against GDP to GDP as well. And when we look at the debt that Canadians held, the household debt and consumer debt coming into this, the Canadian consumer debt was roughly about 35% or about 40% almost higher than US household debt. So we were not in very good shape to come into a major economic downturn as well. Again, it's another really important point to talk about diversification. But as I mentioned before, what I can tell you is we've gone through these kind of events many times before, and this will be no different. We do not know how long the bear market will last, but we do know that we will come out of it and we'll go into another bull market and another period of economic expansion down the road. So this chart is showing the bull and bear markets in Canada since 1955. And it's interesting because when you look at it, you'll see the most recent one. And that's what I mentioned, the Canadian market was up a little under 200% in the last one, and the US market was up 350, so quite a big difference. And it lasted 130 months in length. The downturn in 2008, 2009 is the gray piece right before that. The Canadian market went down 43%, and that downturn lasted a total of 9 months. So when you look at the size of the blue periods and the number of months kind of going from 40 up to 140 months, and you look at the size and the length of the downturns lasting kind of from 7 to 13 months, this is a history that will repeat itself again. So I'm not telling you that we know exactly when the bear market will be over and the bull market will take effect, but we do know that we're going to go through it, and it's important to stick to that plan. So what can you do now to protect your legacy? And why I wanted to bring a little bit of a market update before we get into the estate planning is it's really important. If we're talking about estate planning and we're talking about passing on a legacy to either your family, your loved ones, or maybe even a charity or a combination of the two, then we're talking about still a fairly long time horizon. This is not all money that you've built up that you plan to spend all of it before you pass away. You're talking about leaving some of it going. And when we're looking at investment management, time horizon is the single biggest thing we look at to decide how much of an investment portfolio we want to have in the equity markets. So certainly having a plan, sticking to it, very important. I've talked about the diversification and investing for the long term. Determining your retirement and estate planning strategy, obviously very important as well. And getting professional financial advice. I mentioned at the start that estate planning is a very complex topic, and trying to do this alone is not something that most people are going to be equipped for. So I'd like to shift gears and start with the Estate Planning 101, the overview of the basics. Estate planning is, I think, a lot more at the forefront right now than normal in many people's minds. And certainly when we have the health pandemic coming around and we see lots of people around us getting sick and some, quite a few even passing away, people start thinking a little bit more about their own death. And that's something that human nature keeps people from normally thinking about too much. And estate planning forces you to think about passing away and plan for it appropriately. So we've seen a major uptick in the number of people trying to set up wills, looking for information on wills online, applying for life insurance, all the various things that come into estate planning. And it's not really surprising considering what we're going through right now. So before I go into too much detail on the estate planning, I want to just get a bit of an overview on the current status of everybody on the call and see what is the current status of your own estate plans. So I'm going to launch a poll in just a moment, and everybody has the opportunity to vote. And you can pick A, I have a fully comprehensive estate plan that I review annually and update. B, I have a will that's been updated recently and a health representative agreement as well as an enduring power of attorney in place. C, I'm pretty sure I have an old will somewhere. Or D, I haven't started, but it's on my to-do list for next week. And it's been on that to-do list for probably a couple of years or more. So as I mentioned, I'm just launching this poll, and you should be able to see the poll on your screen in a moment, and you have the ability to vote. Now, the votes are completely anonymous, so please vote, be honest. There's no right or wrong answers here. We're just trying to get a state of where everybody sits so that I know how to gear the rest of the presentation. And I'm just going to leave it open for about 10 or 15 more seconds. I want to give everyone a chance to vote, but as I mentioned, I'm trying to move fairly quick through this. Yeah, 70% have voted. As soon as we cross 80, I'll probably close it down. Okay, I apologize if you didn't have a chance to vote. I'm just trying to be mindful of everyone's time. But I've closed that, and I'm just going to share the results. And Sharon, just let me know if you can see that on the screen. Perfect. So everybody should be able to see the poll results on the screen right now. And you can see pretty good results overall. We've got 28% that have a fully comprehensive plan, another 38% that are certainly a good part of the way there, and they have the basic fundamentals of a plan in place. And 30%, almost a third of our attendees have an old will somewhere, and that's, I would say, quite often a very common response as well. And a couple of you, I'm sure, have it written down on the to-do list on your fridge, and we'll get to this next week after hearing the rest of the presentation. So thank you. That helps me, as I said, gear the rest of the presentation a little bit. I'll get that out of the way. So what is estate planning? It's the process of making a plan in advance of your death and identifying who will receive your assets when you pass on. So everybody's estate plan is going to be a little bit different, but common goals are preserving the value of the estate, enhancing the value of the estate, ensuring delivery of assets to the intended beneficiaries, and that's what's also called almost controlling from the grave and making sure your assets are going where you want. And this is where it kind of gets more individual, is your own individual goals and concerns and family harmony. Because everybody has different goals and ideas of what they'd like to do with their estate, and everybody has a different family situation. So my experience that many people think that they have some form of an estate plan because they have a will. And a will is definitely a part of an estate plan, but it's not enough on its own. And in particular, in the province of British Columbia, where many of our attendees today are from, a will has some unique challenges, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So, blended families, I'm going to jump right into that because this is one of the more unique things. And does your estate plan match your stated intentions? Do you or your spouse have children from previous relationships? And should your new spouse be the direct beneficiary? The reason we ask that and talk about it right off the bat is we've seen many situations where couples have held all their assets in joint names, or they've named their new spouse as direct beneficiary, assuming that when their new spouse passes away, that a portion of that money will still flow back to their kids from their first marriage. And that does not always happen. You see very often where somebody gets remarried and they do not update their will at all. And the courts have time and time again actually upheld some pieces of that and made sure that the children from the first marriage don't get any of the assets at all. It's very important anytime you're going through a major life change like that, that we're looking at the overall estate plan and making changes where appropriate. So that the second slide just shows a little bit of what I'm talking about there. And you can just see when you have the husband and wife at the top of the screen, the husband passes away and they both had children from a previous marriage, all of their joint assets pass on to the wife's children from the first marriage. So please, anybody that's in what we call a blended family, please make sure you're kind of looking into this in more detail. As I mentioned at the start, I don't have a lot of time here to go through any one topic in great detail, but reach out to us if you're in this situation. IG Wealth has an estate planning for blended families guide, and that might be a great first step. You can reach out to any one of us. We can send you a copy of that guide and then follow up with a conversation to answer some questions. So the comfort of the estate plan. A big part of estate planning for many people, as we've already talked about, is protecting your child's inheritance. So by doing that, you want to maximize the value of the estate, minimize income taxes that are going to take a chunk out of the estate before it passes on, certainly providing for dependents after you're gone, and more so for dependents that may have limited ability to earn income on their own, such as a disability. Minimizing delays. We've seen many estates go on for multiple years, and that is often just due to the case of either poor estate planning or no estate planning, of course, or often when you have families that are squabbling over the estate and the estate was not set up clearly enough to protect from that. So children, should fair mean equal? And this is a really interesting topic, especially in British Columbia. And I mentioned I was going to talk a bit more about the Wills Variation Act of BC. So fair doesn't always mean equal. And you can get all sorts of different situations. This slide in the second bullet point says, try not to get too specific about who will receive amounts. It's impossible to know what the actual value of each asset is going to be. Just split it up evenly between the kids. So if you have 2 kids, 50-50. If you have 3 kids, 1/3 each. The problem with that is it may not be that simple. There's many situations where you actually don't want to give the kids the same amount. Let's assume, for example, that one of your children has disowned you. They haven't talked to you in 20 years. Your other child, at great financial strain to themselves and their own family, has taken you in your later years. They spent a lot of money taking care of you. They've done all these different things. They've sacrificed a large part of their own life. And you say, you know, it doesn't really make sense to give my two kids 50-50. You know, the one kid that hasn't called me in 10 years should not get anything, or they should get less. And the other child who has spent a lot of money supporting me over the past 10 years should get more. So you set up your will that way. And here comes the BC Wills Variation Act that says anybody can contest a will in British Columbia for any reason. And whatever the judge is feeling that day when it lands in court is where it's going to end up. So your wishes may or may not be honored if you've simply spelled them out like that in the will and not taken extra steps to protect it. So on one side, we don't want to get too specific in certain situations, and we want to make sure that if you are splitting things evenly, we let the value of the assets figured out at estate time. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure that we're planning properly for that. And this is why I say each situation is different, and it's very important to get proper advice there. So let's take a look at how that might play out. You have 3 children, one of them very attached to the family vacation property. It's worth about $600,000. So if your estate's going to be worth at least 1.8 million, 3 times the 600,000, then you could say, no problem. Let's give each of the 3 children 600,000. If the one child wants to buy the cottage and that's not contested by the other 2, they can use their 600,000 to purchase the cottage from the estate. That would be the very simple way to do it. But of course, we know things aren't always that simple. You may have another child that changes their mind. They may want to take part in that family cottage, and jointly owning a family cottage with the kids may cause all sorts of new issues. You may not have enough money in your estate. You might find out that you had named one child to receive the cottage and the other 2 to receive the money of the estate, and one gets a cottage that's now worth $700,000, $800,000, and the other 2 end up with $200,000 or $300,000 each. Because the state would probably have to pay the capital gains taxes on that cottage if it's not your primary residence as well. So there's all sorts of different planning things come in. But again, my point today is just to make sure that you understand what the potential pitfalls are in estate planning on this side, and put the appropriate measures in to take care of that. And you can see one example that might be use insurance to fund that gap if there's not going to be enough value in the estate to pass the cottage on or pay the capital gains tax. And we can talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. So a will, as I said, is still the centerpiece of your estate plan. Right? The will is that basic document that's going to name your executors, guardians for any minor children, the treatment of your assets after your death, charitable giving intentions, etc. There's a whole bunch of pieces. A properly structured will also go into things like blended families, common law couples, special needs in particular, and that's a very important estate planning topic. So I put a note on there that I put a separate slide in. Beneficiaries of special needs need a very properly customized will. The government in Canada does have quite a few different benefit programs for people with disabilities, and an inheritance could disentitle them from those benefits. So I put a note in there about a Henson Trust. It's sometimes a very good solution, fully discretionary trust that the disabled beneficiary has no control over at all. And because they have no control over it, it's considered to not necessarily be an asset under their control, and it doesn't affect the social assistance benefits. But again, this must be set up properly, and each province has different rules on this as well. So when we get into estate planning for somebody with a disability, it's extremely important that we're looking with somebody with experience in that area and getting the right advice. Now, personal representatives or executors. So those are 2 terms with the same meaning, and it's a person who's responsible for administering an estate. And this, I don't know if I can really be more clear on this, how important it is to put some thought into this. The vast majority of wills in Canada, people will name one of their children as their executor, or potentially even more than one of their children. And there's an awful lot of problems that can happen. If you have joint executors, that means all of your executors, and let's say it's 3 different kids that are joint executors, need to come to agreement on everything that's being done. On the surface, that sounds great because you're making sure that if they're the 3 beneficiaries and also the 3 executors, then they have to agree before anything happens. in reality, think of your 3 kids. Has there ever been a time in their life when all 3 of them didn't perfectly agree on something? I'm pretty sure there was. And I have seen so many cases where this is blown up and the estate is not settled and nothing has been distributed, and it's 4 or 5 years down the road. I just talked to a client, I'd say about 2 months ago, shortly before we started working from home. And I don't even remember how long. It's been about 6, 7 years that her mother's estate has been held up because of the siblings fighting over it and their joint executors. And the advice that she has from her estate lawyer right now is do not expect that to ever be settled, because the structure and the way it was set up was done improperly, and it could be going on in perpetuity. So multiple executors can be a big challenge. And also just the simple, the job function of the executor could be a real challenge. When you think of your kids today, and you're naming them as an executor, you really have to think hard. Do they have the appropriate business background to handle all your business affairs? Do they have the time and the capacity? Is their own family, their own kids kind of keeping their hands full? If your estate is even moderately complex, the executor role could take an awful lot of time. So please think very carefully about doing that. We've seen a lot of families that have been, completely torn up and may never speak to each other again by going through this process and having a family member as executor. So I'm not saying you can't have a child as your executor, but I think you need to think very carefully about it. You also have to make sure they're a Canadian resident, because if you have a foreign resident as an executor, it creates a whole other host of nightmares. And somebody that's a US resident or even a US citizen, so that could be somebody that has US citizenship, even if they haven't lived there once in their life, there's all sorts of other problems that come up, and your state may actually have to file US tax returns as well. So the bullet point on the bottom, I think, is very important. Consider a corporate trustee. Do not use a trustee through one of the big banks. They will charge you an absolute fortune in the fees that they disclose up front. Plus, on top of that, they're also going to have all sorts of hidden fees, and they'll essentially hire people inside their own organization to charge additional fees on top of the trustee fees. It really doesn't work well, but there's plenty of other great trustee organizations that we'd be happy to recommend. And if anybody's looking for one, again, feel free to reach out and we can put you in touch with one. So I mentioned at the start in our poll, I said there was a will, an enduring power of attorney, and a health representative agreement. So a power of attorney can be very confusing for Canadians as well. A power of attorney gives someone else the power and authority to make decisions on your behalf regarding financial matters if you're unable to do so due to mental incapacity. The confusion comes in because people think their power of attorney document allows that person to make decisions on their behalf for financial matters and health matters. But here, those are actually 2 separate documents. So there's a lot of people that have a power of attorney document, which is the financial matters one, and they don't have the health representative agreement, which is that separate document that allows that person to make decisions, health-related decisions if they need to, and you're unable to do so. So if you don't have these documents in place, it can cause all sorts of problems. It can hold up your estate, the sale of your property, etc. And the only option your family's going to have is they actually have to go to the courts and apply to act if you're unable to. And that can take a lot of time and a lot of stress to do so. And again, make sure you're looking at somebody that's a resident of Canada, preferably in your own province if you can, and not a US citizen or green card holder. A testamentary trust, I think it's very important to talk about, but I don't want to go into too much detail, again, in the interest of time. This is a trust that is created upon the death of the testator. So essentially, when you pass away, your will creates the trust the day you pass away. So it's used as an alternative to a direct or outright distribution of estate assets. And then the easiest way to think of it is a trust is its own entity or being. Picture it being like a corporation or even a person almost. And when you pass away, all of your assets can go into that trust, and the trust documents are written in a way that spell how they're going to be dealt with down the road. That trust could remain open for the next 30 years, or it might be wrapped up after 5 years, depending on your wishes. The downside, of course, is there's some extra cost of setting it up, and there's ongoing costs each year. So there's going to be some costs that are coming out of the estate's value every year to pay the trustee fees. But on the flip side, it allows you to take control and decide how assets are distributed. And especially so when you have, say, children you're leaving your estate to that aren't really responsible with money at this stage, and you're worried that they might blow all the money if they get all in one lump sum. Very important tool, and it does come into play with an awful lot of estate planning these days. Estate planning is an ongoing process. So again, thinking back to the poll, I said, do you have a comprehensive estate plan that is regularly updated? You should schedule a review. This is every 3 to 5 years. I'd probably lean on the 2 to 3 year side almost. And also review at any time you have a material change to your life or your situation. So that could be a marriage, children, separation, loss of a spouse. That should be an instant trigger saying we need to revisit or review the estate plans. And I mentioned before with blended families that lots of people get divorced, they get remarried, and they never take a look at their will during that whole time. So scheduling that, putting it into your calendar a couple years in advance, whatever you need to do to make sure you do regular reviews and updates on that is extremely important. So, and on that note, if you do get separated or divorced, you do not have to wait till a divorce is finalized before you're updating your will and your estate plan. That can be done right away. So there's no reason that you need to be delaying. But of course, you also have to think if you have young children and you and your spouse separate, and there's your spouse would be the one, of course, taking care of the children if you pass away, you want to make sure that there is still funds available for that. You have to look out for the kids first and foremost. And on the topic of grandchildren, I know that lots of people think they're great in small doses, and they love seeing them and visiting with them, and then they also love sending them home after they get them all wound up. And people really, grandparents really love their grandkids, and many will look at it, at their estate plan or their will, and say, I want to make sure I put something in there directly for the grandkids. Now, I'm not going to say that that is a bad idea, but you really need to think about that carefully and make sure it's done properly, right? What if other grandchildren are born after you pass away, but you haven't updated your plan, right? What if one of your children has 4 kids and the other has none? Is it okay with you to pass a larger amount of your estate onto that one side of the family because they have kids? And it might be. You just have to think about these things. Minors will receive this inheritance, reaching the age of majority, possibly later. So you have to think, depending on the size of the amount of that gift as well, if they turn 19 or even 18 and they get a lump sum of money all of a sudden, is that a good idea? Will they use it properly? Because they'll have total control over that money. And certainly you want to consider minors should be designated directly as beneficiaries of investment accounts, insurance policies. I think it's a great way to set up certain insurance, but you have to, again, understand all the pros and cons and do it properly. Yeah. Oh, sorry, give myself one note before I go on. It's also, I kind of talked about this, but it's really impossible if the kids are still young to know what if they're not responsible and they're older? What if they have health issues or disabilities? When you're creating your estate plan and you have young grandchildren, you may not know their situation down the road. And that's why I say, again, it's important to be updating it and keep that somewhat fluid if you can. So I'm going to move on to the second half of the estate planning, which is minimizing the impact of tax. And there's 2 types of tax that can impact the value of your estate. So there's what I call the big tax and the little tax. The big tax is income taxes, right? The CRA will treat your estate as though the assets are sold, meaning taxes are due, unless parts of that estate are being inherited by surviving spouses. There's certain exceptions, and I can talk about that in a sec. So the estate normally pays taxes to the government rather than the beneficiaries being the ones paying them. And depending on how you're splitting up assets in your estate, what that can mean is you could split the assets 50-50, and then one of the 2 beneficiaries has to pay the whole tax bill, which would end up being extremely unfair. So you have to understand how that tax works. Of course, there may be things like US taxation as well if you're a US citizen. The little tax, in contrast, is the probate tax. So in British Columbia, it's 1.4%. Most other provinces, it's kind of hovering around the 1% range, other than Ontario, 1.5, and Nova Scotia, 1.6. And that is obviously a much smaller amount of tax. And I kind of look at that and it's, they call it probate fees. So the idea behind that is that they're going to charge a fee to administer the probate on your estate, but really it's an estate administration tax. Because if you have a large estate and they're charging 1.5% of it, it certainly does not cost that large amount of money to do the simple administration and have the probate granted. So looking at the income tax side, what income tax might be due? So income to the date of death, that means if you passed away in October of a given year, all the income that you had from January to October in that current year, pensions, earned income from a job, dividends, etc., there's going to be income that's on that most recent tax return that you haven't claimed yet. Capital assets, so 50% of capital gains included in the final tax return, and that's based off the initial book value as well as what the current fair market value is. And deregistration of registered assets. So unless you can roll over a RIF or an RSP, etc., to a spouse, 100% of the value could also go into your taxation. So let's look at what that might look like. So here's somebody who passed away September 30th. They are still working and they earn $80,000 a year. So we're estimating that they worked 9 out of the 12 months, they earned roughly $60,000. That $60,000 is going to be regular taxable income for the given year. Then they had an investment portfolio, a non-registered account. It was worth $500,000 and the adjusted cost base is $300,000. So there's a $200,000 capital gain. And at the current capital gains inclusion rate, 50%, that's another $100,000 that's taxable. And then they have $300,000 of RSPs or RIFs when they passed away, and they were not able to roll it over their spouse. So they have a $460,000 tax bill in that final year's tax return. Now, that $460,000 is going to be taxed as if it was all earned as income in that final year. So in British Columbia, we used to have that top rate of anything over $150,000. That rate is still there, but they added into the most recent budget a new, what we call super tax, over $220,000, meaning you're going to be paying a very high rate of taxes, over 50% on a big chunk of that money. So, bear with me for a sec. Income tax deferral. This is another big part of the estate planning process, and I've mentioned already that you can roll assets over to a spouse or common law partner, or a trust established for a spouse and common law partner. And it's a little bit interesting the way it works in Canada with the CRA, but if you have $300,000 in your RSPs and you pass away, that $300,000 becomes taxable, but your spouse gets $300,000 of one-time additional RSP room, so they can put it back in, they can get the tax bill and then have the corresponding tax offset for the same $300,000. So it ends up being a non-taxable event. The real benefit to that, of course, is instead of paying taxes on the entire $300,000 at that very high tax rate, in their own retirement, they can pull it out over a period of time and spread it out and pay a much lower tax rate on it. The principal residence exemption is probably the biggest one in Canada. And that means if you bought your house 30 years ago for $100,000 and it's worth $1 million today, if that was your primary residence, that $900,000 of capital gains is non-taxable. And I talked before about that example of the vacation property where I said the vacation property, on the other hand, would be taxable because you can only claim that principal residence exemption on one property. And some people will choose to claim that on their second home or their vacation property instead of their primary residence. And the third big one is charitable giving, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide here. So many people will choose to use charitable donations to reduce their overall estate tax bill. And in some situations, the amount of money that you would pay in tax can be roughly offset by what you donate. So you actually have the choice. Your beneficiaries will end up getting the same amount either way. It's just a choice of, do you want to give the rest of that money to the government in taxes, or do you want to give it to a charity of your choice? And there's a number of different ways we can do that. You can name a charity as a beneficiary of your estate. Donor advised funds. IG Wealth has a charitable giving program, which is, it's really cool how it sets up essentially a tax program where you get all the tax benefits now and you can pass money on over the next couple of years. And securities in kind. So back to that previous example, the non-registered portfolio that had $200,000 in capital gains. If you donate securities directly to a charity that's able to take the securities on, you will get the credit for that full $500,000 amount if you were to donate the whole thing, but you don't have to pay any capital gains on it. So sometimes there's unique examples where we want to use direct securities, and that could be stocks or mutual funds, passing on to a charity. And the other option, which isn't on here, but I should have mentioned, is also life insurance. There's ways that you can set up a life insurance policy now and name the charity as a beneficiary. You can keep that policy in your own name and make the premiums, and then when you pass away, your estate is going to get the credit for that full insurance amount that gets paid out to the charity. You can also donate the policy, the ownership of the policy, to the charity now. And every year when you send them the funds to make the premium payments, you get an instant tax credit at the time for those donations. Both strategies have pros and cons, and again, this is why the estate planning process is important to figure out what will work for you. Now, talking more about the little tax, the probate estate administration tax, it, as I talked about, varies from province to province, and it's calculated on the fair market value of all the assets in the estate. So what we've seen historically is people will spend a lot of time focusing on how to minimize their probate and estate taxes, and not enough time figuring out how to minimize the income taxes, which are so much larger. But having said that, it's still important to look at those probate taxes and figure out if it makes sense to reduce them. And the most obvious way to reduce them is to pass certain assets outside of the estate. But that comes with its own risks, because the estate should be set up so that it can administer them properly. So again, pros and cons to both sides, but very important to understand. So I talked about this, I think, 10 or 15 minutes ago, and I wanted to just bring it up a little bit more, because I talked about how you could split your assets 50-50 between two children, and it end up not getting the same amount, and that's due to the estate and probate. So let's say you have $200,000 of RSPs and $200,000 of non-registered investments, and you give one account to each child. The full $200,000 goes to child number one, and they get a check for $200,000 in their pocket. But remember, that entire $200,000 is taxable to your estate. The non-registered assets go into the estate and form part of the estate, so they're paying the tax bill. We assumed it was around $75,000 in this situation. Once the tax bill is paid, the leftover 125 goes out to child number two. And this, when you see it on the screen, probably sounds pretty straightforward, but this is a very common estate planning mistake as well. So you need to make sure that those taxes are properly accounted for if you're trying to move some assets, such as an RSP account, to one of the children outside of the estate to remove those probate fees. And that's what I said, it's not necessarily bad to cut down on the probate fees, but only if they're planned for properly. The most common estate planning question we probably hear is, should I consider joint ownership? And this comes up, I think, most often when one of the two spouses has already passed, there's one remaining spouse, and they say, you know, I read somewhere that I should add my child or children onto the title of my house so that I can pass it outside the estate and save on those taxes. Generally, it's not going to be a good idea. There's certain situations where we might recommend it, but I would say 9 times out of 10, we're going to say no. That small amount of probate tax is not going to offset all the risks of that unequal division of the estate, like I just said, and the impact of, say, one of your children having a marriage breakdown. So if you name your son as a co-owner of your home, and your son and his wife get divorced, she can go after 50% of your home, because that is an asset that's in your son's name. And that can cause all sorts of problems that are typically not worth avoiding that probate tax for. It can also have capital gains consequences depending on how the CRA looks at the primary residence exemption as well. So a power of attorney document is going to make a lot more sense typically than a joint owner of assets. And in a blended family situation, if you have children from a first marriage, you also have to look carefully at adding your spouse on as a joint owner as well for some of the same reasons. So again, just be aware of that and some of the risks. So I've kind of talked about this already, but the direct beneficiary designation, so that could be on an RSP account, it could be on a life insurance policy. And it may work, it may help you avoid some probate, but only if the taxes are taken care of properly. A few times throughout the presentation, I've talked about insurance and how that can help. And life insurance can definitely form a part of estate planning, again, if it's done properly. And I say properly because I do think there's a lot of people out there that work in the insurance business that will try to show all sorts of fancy graphs and charts and say, you should set up this huge insurance policy. It's going to maximize your estate. And they're only looking at the sale of an insurance policy, and they're not looking at how that impacts the rest of your financial plan. And all of a sudden, you've paid in this policy for 10 years and find out you don't have enough money to live on in your retirement, and you have to collapse it and lose a lot of the money you put in. So insurance is a very important part of estate planning. We use it all the time, but it's really important that it's set up properly as well. Now, insurance in the earlier years, you use it to protect your family. So if you have a family with young children, your number one goal for insurance is providing for lost income if you pass away and can no longer earn an income to support your spouse and children. That does shift when we get into estate planning, and then we start looking at it for debt repayment, maximizing the value of the estate, planning for capital gains taxes, say on that family cottage that you want to pass along, or making sure you equalize inheritances. And another great example of that, if you have a family business and one child is going to, works in a family business, and the plan is for them to take it over when you pass away, and the other child has no involvement in the family business, insurance is a great way to ensure that there's an adequate amount of insurance for that second child so that they each receive the same amount of assets or equity. So I know that's a lot of information, and I know that I went through it really quickly, but I was determined to keep this down to an hour, and I've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. So what I want to do is talk about how do you take all that information and turn it into action? How do you get started with all this? This is the 4 basic steps for estate planning. And I know I'm simplifying, a very complex topic, but this is really how you start. Step number 1, you need to make decisions on your own. And a financial planner can help talk you through these decisions and help give you the pros and cons. But at the end of the day, you have to decide who you'd like to benefit from your estate, whether that's only your children, whether that's other family members or charities or whatever you happen to choose. The next step is you have to start looking at the after-tax value of your estate, and that comes in with the larger financial planning process, where we can take a look at total assets today and liabilities. We can look at the amount of growth that we're going to see in those assets. We can take away the amount that you're going to be using for retirement funds, and we kind of drill down to figure out what your estate's going to be looking at depending on when you pass away. Then we can start the planning process itself and figure out how to work on the estate plan. Often, as we mentioned, insurance may come in there. If there's a gap, we may put an insurance strategy in place to fund that gap. And then finally, we bring the estate lawyers in and we start updating legal documents, updating beneficiary designations where necessary. So this can seem like an overwhelming process with estate planning, but don't let it be overwhelming to you. It is not that hard to start, and a financial planner can definitely walk you through step by step and ask you the appropriate questions, because you may not know what questions you want to ask or what questions you should be asking. Now, the financial planning approach is the last piece I wanted to show on here, and just to kind of explain how that all works. So a synchronized holistic financial plan, I think in times like this, when the economy is going through a major downturn and we have a global pandemic, it just highlights more than ever how important it is. A holistic financial plan is going to have either 5 or 6 key pillars that come into it. So starting at the top right, we have managing cash flow. A lot of business owners in particular, and individual households, are finding out how important it is to have an emergency fund, how important it is to not live paycheck to paycheck when that paycheck or the business revenue all of a sudden gets cut off. A financial plan will make sure that your cash flow is being managed efficiently and there's sufficient liquidity there so that when we have a time like we're having right now, or the next one, because we will have another one down the road, that your cash flow is being managed properly. Preparing for the unexpected is, for example, like I said, if you pass away at a young age and you have young children, then certainly you want to make sure there's income there. And if you pass away later years into retirement, you want to make sure, again, that everything is taken care of, your surviving spouse is taken care of properly. And that's kind of the insurance piece in a lot of financial plans. Planning for major expenditures. As people get in the estate planning process, sometimes that the amount of times that we're looking at that is reduced, but some people may still want to, as part of their estate plans, buy that family property or do something. So we want to make sure any major expenses are planned for appropriately. For those that are business owners, we tie the business financial plan directly into the personal financial plan, because really, for most business owners, they're one and the same. There's no way that we can do planning on one side or the other without looking at the whole picture. Optimizing your retirement is obviously a very big part of financial planning, and that's making sure that you're putting enough money away and that you're investing it properly so that you have sufficient funds to live on in retirement and enjoy your retirement the way you want. And finally, sharing your wealth, and that's the estate planning pillar. So sharing your wealth, again, can be with family, it can be with charities, whatever you happen to choose. The reason I wanted to highlight why a holistic financial plan is so important, because in our industry, and in Canada in particular, the average financial plan is typically just a quarterly investment statement. So when you talk to somebody and say, do you have a financial plan? And often they'll say, yeah, I do. And you say, can I see it? And they pull out their latest quarterly statement that shows what they're invested in, the rate of return, and hopefully it shows the fees that they're paying to do that. And that's it. An investment statement is not a financial plan. A financial plan covers in detail all 6 of these pillars, and it details your current financial situation and where you are today. It outlines all of your goals and where you'd like to be in the future and what you'd like to see happen. And then it's a detailed roadmap of how to get there. And it's a living document that is continuously updated as things go along, just like your estate plan, but probably more so, because life changes, the economic environment changes, everything we do know is going to change. So when we create a financial plan, and that might be a 40 or 50-page document, we know that it's accurate when we create it, and it's probably accurate for a couple of weeks afterwards, and then it'll start having some changes from outside influence. So that's why it's so important to be regularly updating those plans. Now, how are we doing all that? We definitely use a team approach here at IG. So this slide, if you look at yourself in the middle with your own goals and concerns, both personal and business, your family situation and your overall current situation, and your quarterback, your financial planner is sitting there right above you. And it's not just a straight relationship between you and the financial planner. There's all these other professionals and team that come into play. So on the right, we have the in-house specialists. I introduced you briefly to our estate and insurance specialist, our securities and our mortgage specialist. But we also have our advanced financial planning department, which is run nationally. And we have a huge team of tax lawyers, estate specialists, advanced financial planners, and they deal with all sorts of things. So that could be cross-border taxation. That could be kind of more complicated charitable giving programs that we want to set up. It could be blended family situations where the lawyer that set up your will may not have enough experience in that area. So we need to bring in someone that does. And all those resources are available. And some of those people in the advanced financial planning team may be responsible for helping to create your financial plan or update your financial plan, depending on your situation, how complex it is. We have certainly our world-class sub-advisor investment management team. And without going into too much detail, because I don't want to talk too much on the investment side today, we do not have any in-house managers. We, for our investment portfolios, use all third-party managers, and I'll tell you why that's so important. I can give you one quick example to explain it. In the olden days, somebody in Canada would go to one of the big banks, and if they had a decent-sized portfolio, they'd meet with a stockbroker. And that stockbroker would build them a basket of Canadian stocks, so they'd have absolutely no diversification. Because, of course, there's complications of buying foreign stocks, especially if you're over a certain net worth. Now, let's say they're trying to expand the portfolio a bit and they want to buy, they come to you one day and say, I'd like to buy Starbucks. We're going to buy some shares of Starbucks in your portfolio. And you say, okay, why is that? Well, the broker says, I read the last company report that was written 2 months ago, and it seems like Starbucks is doing pretty well. They've had some good earnings the past couple of quarters, and they'll probably continue. So it seems like a good buy. Now let's fast forward to the large global asset managers that we put our clients' money with today. I'm going to use BlackRock as an example because they're the largest asset manager in the world, and we use them on a number of our portfolios. BlackRock owns their own satellites, and one of the many, many things those satellites do with all the computer algorithms that control them is they track how many people go in and out of every Starbucks location in the world every day. So if you have 700 million people going into a Starbucks in a month of October typically, and this October we have 780 million or 800 million people, BlackRock already knows that the earnings are going to be up on Starbucks. And BlackRock actually has that information before Starbucks does. So this is the new day and age of investment management is we need to use that scale and we need to use the proper technology to build quality diversified portfolios and not sit there with a basket of stocks, because that there are still people doing it, but it just shouldn't be done anymore. So currently we have 5 of the 7 largest asset managers in the world. If you look at the top 7 asset managers globally, 5 of those 7 are running our portfolios. And in addition to that, we also have probably another 10 or 12 right now. And those are being constantly changed and updated as we kind of review and manage them. So we've got a team of chartered financial analysts to look at them and decide if we need to make any changes on which sub-advisors we're using. I mentioned Mark, our mortgage specialist. So we do have mortgage, lending, all of that built in-house. We do that in partnership with National Bank. And in certain situations and certain plans, it does make sense to look at a lending solution. Insurance companies I've talked about already, and we have all the largest insurance companies in Canada on our product shelf. And finally, there's your own personal advisors. So your own lawyers, accountants, they have often a lot of history with you. They know your situation, they know your family, they know your business. So we obviously want to bring them into the fold and bring them into the whole planning process where it's appropriate, but also use our own in-house lawyers and accountants so we don't run up lawyer and accountant fees for you. And our process, I promise this is getting at the end here, of creating one of these plans. As I mentioned, we start with looking at your current situation. Next, we clarify your goals and objectives. And then we get into developing that comprehensive plan, customizing the investment program, implementing the plan. And as I mentioned before, it's very important to proactively monitor and adjust on a regular basis. So with that, I'd like to wrap the presentation up. We're going to be kind of right at the 1 hour mark. If anybody on the line is a current client of IG Wealth and does not have their full financial plan or updated plan in place, or their estate plan, please reach out to your consultant. We'd be more than happy to set that up or review that or update it for you. And as you can see by using the Zoom software, we can do that while everybody's kind of locked down and socially isolated. The technology takes a little bit of getting used to, but we can do this. It's no problem to get it set up. And we have a number of, Zoom is one of the things we're using. We're also using Microsoft Teams. We have a number of different options depending on what's most comfortable for you. And we can share our screens just like we're using today. For anybody that's on the call that's not a client of IG Wealth currently, that is not getting all of this service from their existing institution, again, please feel free to reach out to whoever invited you to the call today, or you can reach out to myself as well. We'd be more than happy to set up a no obligation, no pressure consultation and just kind of explain a little bit more about how we do this and what strategies you can be looking at today to reduce the taxes and lower the impact of volatility for your portfolios. With that, I am going to open it up to questions. And you can see that on the screen, I've got my email address, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Feel free to reach out directly to the consultant that invited you today. If you're not sure who that was, or if you have any questions for me, brett.millard@ig.ca. I'm more than happy to answer questions. And other than that, we will open up to questions from the audience. So again, if you move your mouse around on the screen, I think you might have to go up to the top and you're going to see that Q&A option. You click on that. You have the option to submit a question with your name, or you can just select the box and submit it anonymously, and we can go from there. So I'm going to give that a second, see if there's any questions that come in. The first question that just popped up is related to setting up a will during lockdown. And I think it's a little bit different from what I just talked about with the financial planning and estate planning process, that to actually put a will in place, you would have to meet with the lawyer notary in person. So that does not mean you can't get started. You can very easily have one of these Zoom calls with the lawyer notary to get all the pieces in place. They can go together, get the final documentations done. They can send it to you for review. And then once the self-quarantine is lifted, you can go in and sign it. And I will argue the courts will look at those things. So because we're in very unusual circumstances, if you have your will completed now and you put something in writing to the lawyer that's completed it and to your family members to make them all aware that this is your current will and your wishes, you sign a copy and leave it at home, then the courts can look at that and say, hey, this is okay for the time being. There's no guarantee of that, but it would be up to the judge down the road. But you've been very clear on what your wishes are, and there's a reason you could not get in front of a lawyer or notary to actually sign it. And again, please feel free to submit any other questions you'd like. Is that the only question? Well, either I covered the material really well, or I lost you completely partway through. I'm not sure which, but I will say thank you very much for dialing in today. I hope you found it informative. And again, my email address is on the screen, brett.millard@ig.ca. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or follow-up. And if you have anybody that you think would benefit from listening to this presentation as well, reach out to either myself or the consultant that invited you. I will be able to send them a copy of the presentation, including my comments on it as well. So we'd be more than happy to share a link with anybody that they can either view online or even download. And I'll leave things running for a few more minutes because now I see a couple questions popping in as well.